Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to link a couple of things that that I've engaged in recently. I was first basically looking about carbon pricing and Smith and modern problems. I was first forced to think about carbon trading in late 1999 when I was invited to the World Council of Churches to deliver an opening keynote to their colloquium on climate change in Saskatoon. Two immediate questions arose: why Canada and why me? The answer to the first one should be obvious. I'd long harboured a suspicion that global warming is a conspiracy by Canadians to make their country habitable, a conspiracy that many of them own up to, even if they hadn't thought of it themselves. The answer to the second is much less obvious. Those who appreciate just how rare my outbursts of Protestant religiosity are may wonder what denomination I adhere to. The same question was actually asked of me in Saskatoon, and I was in the mood for answering questions. I'd transited through Hawaii, and the Americans, who actually love to fingerprint everybody. If you stop in Hawaii on your way to Vancouver, you actually have to fill out a green visa waiver form in order to walk from one aeroplane into the terminal and back to the same airport. And of course, you've got to answer every question, or you certainly feel it's a good idea to do so, including, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The first response, so therefore, when they asked me in Saskatoon, what denomination are you, I felt I actually had to answer. And my first answer was that I was a lapsed Anglican. After a couple of days, I realised that this was an incoherent position. The Anglican Church is probably unique for being the only religious institution established for non-religious purposes. As I'm fond of saying, it's been true to its foundations ever since. The problem is that if no beliefs are required, you cannot lapse from them. Any attempt to repudiate Anglicanism by rejecting what you believe to be a core belief will only lead to introductions to others with similar ideas, and in my case, an invitation to lecture at an Anglican seminary on my really interesting Anglican ideas. At this moment, I appreciate the genius of the Anglican Church. They often say once a Catholic, always a Catholic, but actually fundamentally, once an Anglican, always an Anglican. Because it's the one faith that requires none. You're trapped by the fact that it's a faith that requires none, and so you can't lose it. A bit like modern political parties. As you may guess, I was not actually invited for my faith, but invited for my interest in the interconnected ethical, economic, legal, and political issues involved in the reduction of carbon emissions to limit the extent by which Canadian habitability was tempered by the adverse consequences of the habitability of the rest of the planet. The other element of this is I was first forced to think about Adam Smith and contemporary problems when I was asked to do another keynote in another city at a conference to celebrate the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This was, of course, as the Chinese Vice Premier pointed out in that same year, 2009, that Adam Smith wrote two books, and it was not so much a prequel, but a foundation for the wealth of nations. I could divert you with stories about debating CDOs with the guy who wrote them and the incapacity of the Bank of England to see a bubble when it blew out of their mouth, but we'll get on to the topic in a moment. When Brendan suggested I bring together some of the things I'd said on both these topics over the last couple of years, I actually thought of a Financial Times exchange initiated by David Rubenstein about Adam Smith. David Rubenstein is one of the founders of the Carlyle Group, a group that does a lot of things that they think are useful, including private equity. He purported to write a letter to modern capitalists, that was his title, from Adam Smith in January this year. Now, it was very interesting because it was very clear as soon as I started reading this letter from Adam Smith written by David Rubenstein, that the Adam Smith writing was a very modern fellow who not only was very attuned to modern issues such as the financial cliff and the EU monetary crisis, but whose originality was demonstrated by the complete lack of any repetition of the ideas from his own works. He certainly did not quote from his earlier work, and there are a whole lot of ideas that just show how far his thinking had developed and how similar it had grown to that of David Rubenstein. Most notable of all, there was no mention of Adam Smith's notoriously jaundiced view of joint stock companies, where he famously said that merchants do not gather together, even for the most innocent of merriments, but that a conspiracy against the public interest is constructed. No doubt, of course, this was in due deference to the medium through which he had chosen to speak. I realise, of course, that Adam Smith was unaware of the genius of what Rubenstein and others call private equity, and whether he would share my sense of irony that those who join with other investors to take over large public companies should call their enterprises private, or the even greater irony that they could use the term equity when the whole enterprise was entirely fuelled by debt. It did occur to me that David was trying possibly a takeover bid, something he's very good at, of Adam Smith with virtually no intellectual capital and a lot of ideas borrowed from other self-styled capitalists. Given the quality of those ideas, I hope he didn't pay much for them, and I certainly hope that this has not been subsidised by the public purse, as so many private equity failures seem to do. I think in relating this little story about David Rubenstein, I want to emphasise that I do not have the chutzpah to attempt anything similar. I'm not launching a counterbid, and at one point I actually suggested to Brendan that I might resile from this title lest I be seen to be doing the same thing. But I am doing something different. Unlike David Rubenstein, I do not have direct quotes from aboard again Adam Smith. I have not attempted to contact him with a séance, a time machine, the application of DNA sequencing, carbon dating, or of course the measurement of the amount of carbon in his cold climate, his cold climate corpse. Nor have I taken myself off to a clinic to enjoy the self-delusional episode as the great man himself. As you can see, I'm not even trying to recreate my Anglican past of 35 years ago, let alone try to 45 years ago, let alone try to find myself in the mind of another man long, well and dead. And indeed, I'm not even going to engage in what many people do, an exegesis of Smith's two books, to try to prove that he would indeed think exactly the same way as I do. But what I do want to do, and I think I want to emphasise this, in having emphasised so much what I'm not doing, is I want to take up to suggest an approach to ethics and economics that was central to Adam Smith, and the way in which he linked the two might be an inspiration of how we might deal with the global carbon crisis. I start with one of his most famous quotes, a quote which some might think makes Adam Smith a natural-born carbon trader, destined no doubt to work for the Carlyle Group if only it had existed in those times. Adam Smith famously said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own self-interest." And this is often used as sort of an image for the unseen hand and why we should leave it all to markets and to people like David Rubenstein and the Carlyle Group. As I pointed out, of course, one could equally say it is not the malevolence of the mortgage broker that writes the ninja loan. I could say actually the malevolence of the private equity expert who borrows up a storm. It is not the malevolence of the agency that rates at AAA. It is not the malevolence of the arms manufacturer that invents the cluster bomb, or the malevolence of the energy company that cooks the planet. It is, of course, as Adam Smith said, it is from regard to their own self-interest. Self-interest is a very important motivation. You can harness it to your benefit, or ignore it at your cost. But I think that the juxtaposition of the two quotes, the actual one from Adam Smith and my adaptation of that to the present day, shows that there are other critical variables in determining whether self-interest puts food, organic food, on our plantation timber table, or cluster bombs in an overheated and a flood-prone backyard that's just been repossessed by a zombie bank. The key question is, what are those other variables that will lead to the non-malevolent outcome that Adam Smith described, rather than the non-malevolent outcome which we fear and which we sometimes face? Smith's first book is now seen primarily to concern moral philosophy, and the second, economics. So some might say a very simple answer is, ethicists take over the world, that moral philosophy or ethics is prior to and more important than economics and constitutes the relevant variable. But I don't actually think Smith would have said that, despite the fact that he had a chair in moral philosophy and despite his love of his first book. He and other contemporaries lived before a separation of the discipline of ethics, economics, which are thereby, prioritised. Like Bentham, Smith would have seen little point in separating the modern disciplines of law, ethics, political science, and economics, whose separate formation postdates their work and their insights. They sought to address the major problems of their day within an intellectual space which encompassed all of those disciplines. I believe that they would have seen it as fatuous to attempt to solve the problems they tackled from the perspective of only one of those disciplines. Like most of those now examining the global financial crisis and what I call the global carbon crisis, they would have recognised that a core part of the problem was the institutional context within which self-interest and other passions, as David Hume would have called it, operate. They would have been particularly harsh on someone who sought to tackle the institutional problems within the confines of any one of those disciplines, whether or not ethics was placed first, or, as is most commonly done, now last. But that is exactly what's being attempted now, and it's exactly that I think that I want to draw on the spirit of Adam Smith to deconstruct. Unfortunately, each of those disciplines, the successor disciplines to the intellectual space in which they operated, each has a strongly theorised but limited conception of institutions, which colours the way with institutions, their problems and the solutions. Quite simply, lawyers, and I'm a lawyer for all my sins, or probably a major part of my sins. As a lawyer, I actually know that lawyers, when they look at institutions, they look at formal rules, they look at contracts and constitutions. If there's a problem with the institution, it's a problem with the way those rules are written, and the solution, of course, is, like all lawyers do, to throw rules at problems. Ethicists, and again, I think this is I'm the ethicist part of my time, ethicists look at institutions in terms of informal norms, cultures, values, and so forth. And if there's a problem with the institution, the values haven't been properly stated, or else they haven't been built into the actions of those who work within the organisation. Political scientists say, no, Charles, none of that. It's all about power, who gets what and how. And if there's a problem, it's a problem with the structure of the power structure. And the solution, of course, is to fix that power structure, normally with them running the show. Economists, of course, bless their hearts, if you can find them. No, economists, I take that. That was just a cheap shot. Because actually I'm going to say how important the role of economists actually are. Provided they're operating within an interdisciplinary space. Economists, when they look at institutions, look at incentives and disincentives. If there's a problem, it's perverse incentives. The solution is to align incentives with the behaviour that you want. The point that I want to make is that they all have a vital insight. Ignore their insights and your reforms will be worthless. But to try to reform the institutions that cause our problems, just with lawyers, economists, and they're the ones, they are the most guilty parties who imagine they can fix it all themselves, or political science, or even ethicists, is actually, as I believe, fatuous. Of course, the thing is that there's been a huge explosion in knowledge and skills with each of those disciplines, and so that the way in which that interdisciplinary space can be addressed is not merely from an individual like Adam Smith or Jeremy Bentham, who actually had all those the predecessors of those disciplines in his own mind, but it does mean you need the kind of interdisciplinary research and considerations that are necessary to deal with those many disciplines. There's another complication which I want to emphasise, and that is that not only do those who want to study problems of institutions have disciplinary specialisation, they also tend to specialise in a particular kind of discipline. Many study public institutions, government institutions, others corporations, professions, international institutions, subnational institutions, regional institutions, NGOs, and sometimes even churches. But the really big problems we have today cannot be sheeted home to any one of those institutions or any one level of institutional governance. The worst problems we have are where weaknesses at one level of governance are exacerbated by weaknesses at other levels of governance. Classically the case when it comes to security issues. There's a weakness in governance at one particular country or between two countries, and which is exacerbated by weaknesses at the international level. When it comes to global carbon crisis, there are weaknesses in international institutions, obviously, national, subnational, corporate governance, the way investors operate, and so forth. And that the global financial crisis is a similar multi-level institutional problem as is the global carbon crisis. In dealing with what I now call the global carbon crisis, we need the insights of all the successive disciplines about all the institutions that have a capacity to deal with the greatest challenge of our time. There's a lot that I've written on this, and there's a lot more needs to be written and considered on it, and much that has been written by people from the various disciplines about the various levels of institutions involved. Tonight, as I say, I want to emphasise the point I made in Saskatoon and have been trying to make since, that addressing the excess of carbon emissions, we cannot rely solely on economic factors, such as carbon pricing. We need to look at carbon price, which argues is best pursued through a form of carbon tax. But we also must have, first and foremost, an ethical pull that draws us towards a low-carbon vision of the good life. And so this is what I want to emphasise. An ethical pull is necessary in addition to an economic push. And in fact, the two need to work together, and that is, as I say, my basic take-home message from Adam Smith's work. So firstly, the ethical pull. I would argue that, and I argued in 2000, I still argue now, the fundamental driver of our climate problems is the incipient spread of an unsustainable Western vision of the good life. Resource-intensive, high-carbon Western lifestyles are frequently criticised not only as unsustainable and deeply unsatisfying, yet I must say, and I could spend time on this, it seems to be based upon a Baudrillard's version of utilitarianism that even Jeremy Bentham would shy away from. Jeremy Bentham was a great believer in utilitarianism, and many people believe that this is the basis of sort of modern market economics. But he, of course, emphasised a really important principle, the principle of diminishing marginal utility. The first loaf of bread makes you happy. The second loaf of bread adds your happiness a bit. The third loaf of bread might add to your happiness very little, and from a modern perspective might actually make you fat. Of course, it's hard to measure utility directly. So many decide that what they'll do is to measure dollars instead of happiness. Much, much easier. Until the Carlyle group come in and you don't know how many dollars there are. But still, it's so much easier to measure dollars than it is to measure happiness. And so therefore completely contrary to the principle of diminishing marginal utility, that the maximising of dollars becomes an attempted alternative to maximising happiness. And it's what I call a dollarised, however you want to spell it, version of the good life that is not good and may not be much of a life. However, whether by good marketing or bad habits, these lifestyles are still attractive to a majority of Westerners and to a high proportion of the developing world's middle classes. In so doing, northern profligacy has become southern aspiration. Even if confined to the West, such lifestyles are unsustainable. Their extension to the rest of the world increases the downward spiral of ecological catastrophe. As I put it in 2000, if the Chinese decide to go for cars or beef in even tenth our own interests, then we'll all be knee deep in warm water. Since the 1970s, there have been many pleas for Western nations to desist from unsustainable aspects of their lifestyle, and more ascetic lifestyles have been advocated. While some will choose less energy-intensive and environmentally damaging versions of the goods and services they desire, self-denial has rarely been widely popular among those who can indulge themselves. And the numbers pursuing unsustainable lifestyles has increased over the last 30 years rather than decreased. In sum, the key problem is the West has invented and proselytised an unsustainable vision of the good life that other countries seek to emulate. I really want to emphasise, I don't think there is any solution to climate change until sustainable conceptions of the good life are developed, that Westerners and those who would emulate them want to live, and which others might want to adopt. I think this is very important in trying to identify visions of the good life that we'll actually value, that are sustainable, and it may well be that that vision may come as much from, or more, from the developing world as from the developed. But fortunately, and this is what I actually, over the Christmas dinner, for the first Christmas dinner for the Key Centre, I remember having this conversation with Noel Preston. And when he said, well, Charles, would you give up meat to save the planet? And I said, well, actually, I like a bit of meat, and I'd probably prefer to cut down to what I call the Chinese diet of a lot of rice and just a little bit of tasty meat. But yes, that's not the most important thing in my life. It's really made me think about it. It hasn't made me change, I've got to admit. But the point is that the things we really value most in our life don't break the carbon bank. What we really enjoy is companionship with people we value, doing a job that is important to us, which makes us feel as we contribute. And as I think that was the unanimous view of the table, decomposed vegetable matter in our glasses that made the communication and conviviality all that much more pleasant. I think this is a very important point, because I actually had a vegetarian manager for several years. That's the manager. I was the director, she was the manager, and I said the director directed the manager, and the manager managed the director. So it was a very interesting, complex governance arrangement. It worked brilliantly. The one thing is I did say to her, she was actually a total vegetarian and a real tippler. And I said, what would you do if wine was made out of animal products? And she said, Charles, two things I'll say. Firstly is that vegetarians are extraordinarily capable of sort of making substitutes when they want to. And secondly, it's not. I think the point is, though, that sideways things. I really want to emphasise that actually the things we really value, the things that make our life worthwhile, actually don't break the carbon bank. And when you look at Martin Nussbaum's competences, anything you look through, any things that are really valued, even by Anglicans if you can find it, actually won't break the carbon bank. And so a sustainable vision of the good life is not only necessary, but it's actually possible. And we need to look at that, because we want to find, not to say, as I say, asceticism can be really, really noble, but most people aren't and won't become ascetics. You want to say they really want to live these sustainable visions of the good life. That's the essential ethical pull. However, while the ultimate solution to climate change is the development of low-carbon lifestyles, it's very important that economic incentives support and stimulate that search for sustainable visions of the good life. As I say, the sustainable visions provide an ethical pull. The economic incentives and disincentives provide an economic push. And of course, most people have agreed that one of the key elements of this, either the or the central key, is to put a price on carbon. The currently favoured approach, and now as it was then, is to set a cap and then cut total emissions with the trading of emission rights, in emission rights, to provide incentives to those who can most efficiently cut their carbon and minimise the cost. This approach is unsurprisingly popular in states emitting the most carbon, because what it does is effectively gives them a property right to emit. Let's think about this really plainly. The lawyer in me will tell you, and most of you will know, that for a market to work, you have to have property rights which are traded. So the really interesting question, I know I had a discussion with an old friend who's a shadow minister. At the time he was a minister, he said, "Charles, look, everybody knows that in economics, initial distributions don't matter." And I said, if you're trying to negotiate with developing countries, initial distributions of carbon rights to emit really do matter. It's a matter it's not just a matter of justice, but it's a matter of what people will agree to. When an activity is shown to be harmful and unsustainable, it is not immediately obvious that the appropriate response is to create property rights to continue the harmful activity and give the greatest property rights to those countries or corporations which have done the most harm and have been externalising their costs on others who have suffered and will continue to suffer from the harm done. It actually creates a property right in externalising your costs. You discover there's an externalised cost, okay, you've got a property right to externalise your costs. This idea is popular in the West and with those who would profit from the operation of those markets. It is unpopular in non-Western countries who would be given less rights. Indeed, why would they agree? A lot of those people have spent the last decade worrying about how to persuade America to take part. They do not seem to have appreciated the obvious objection I've just stated and seem to be surprised at the forcefulness of developing countries in Copenhagen and said, it's not fair, we aren't going to do it. The point is that whenever large amounts of assets are to be found, so there will be attempts to appropriate them. When a large body of assets is created, a temptation, corruption risk is correspondingly very, very large. And in fact, the thing is that at the last International Anti-Corruption Conference, the corruptibility and the corruption problems of carbon permits and carbon offsites was widely discussed. If in fact there is a worldwide agreement to allocate large numbers of property rights to emit carbon to those who have emitted the most carbon, those countries and companies that have emitted the most carbon, it'll be the greatest private appropriation of public assets since the Russian privatisations of the early 1990s, except they'll be global in scope. And also, I argue that this approach of creating property rights in unsustainable activities also has the effect of encouraging market players to look for the next unsustainable activity in which they can benefit from similarly grandfathered rights. In fact, it'd be interesting if that's the way we deal with our problems, okay, so carbon emissions is actually a huge problem. So what's the next huge problem we're going to recognise? Let's actually maximise it. And so that let's buy up all the people who are emitting whatever else it is we discover is going to be damaging and seek to corner the market in that, and then we'll be given property rights in this unsustainable activity. Faith in such markets, I would argue, may be misplaced in this case, just as it's being sorely tested in the economic crisis that's carried on for the last 4 years and may carry on for considerably long, 5 years and considerably longer. The relevant commodity carbon is not well understood, and knowledge will be asymmetric, allowing market players many opportunities for arbitrage and taking advantage of the ignorance of those who need to access the market to continue their businesses. This process leads to increased costs and risks of doing business, so that much of the extra costs of doing business will actually end up in the hands of market players rather than consumers or producers who have to pay higher prices. There is also the possibility that everybody loses. New markets often get it wrong. In fact, I've said, if the global financial crisis had occurred before Kyoto, how many people would really be suggesting that we should follow this kind of market solution in a commodity that's unknown? To me, actually, the final argument, I don't have anything against Macquarie Bank, and I don't have that much against the Carlyle Group. And in fact, some of the things David Rubenstein said was remarkably sensible, even if I've no reason to believe that Smith would have said them, apart from the importance of education, which, as any Scot would know, is critical. But the moment that Macquarie Bank started saying gee, this trading, this carbon trading is a good idea, I started wondering. And that's why I talk about beware of merchant banks bearing gifts. They're terribly keen to enter it. While many are aware of entrusting them with the contents of their piggy banks, I'm not happy to entrust them with the future of the planet. There are many memories of the way in which new markets are prone to fluctuation and profiteering through asymmetric knowledge. I want to make a really basic point here about markets and taxes. In promoting volatility, traders benefit at the expense who need to exchange currencies to conduct business through a combination of asymmetric knowledge and outright manipulation. Although some risks could be hedged, long-term risk was uninsurable. By increasing the risk of doing business, it discourages those would of otherwise profitable investment. And I want to emphasise that actually volatile prices are really good for traders and really bad for long-term investors. So you've got to actually make a decision as to whether the way in which we're going to deal with this fundamental challenge, not the most fundamental moral challenge we have, the most fundamental challenge we have, moral, legal, political and economic. If we're going to deal with this challenge, should we adopt governance mechanisms which actually promote volatility, create enormous benefits for arbitrage and for sometimes market manipulation or just asymmetric knowledge? Because I've got to tell you, I do operate in real markets. I've actually grew up in a family company that does importing, and I know how markets work. And I know that actually that people profit from markets not because of some totally bold competition, but in fact they do it because there's a market niche, there's a knowledge, there's some asymmetric knowledge they actually have, which allows them to actually profit. And when it comes to the markets for currencies and what would be for carbon, asymmetric knowledge is the typical thing, and that's why, in fact, merchant banks and others can profit from it. But the point is that if you have a variable price, then you don't know whether the 50-year investment you're making in a power station or a mine or a new process for producing the goods and services that others want, then in that case the thing is that the price signal is much weaker because there is a huge risk. And as I say, volatility benefits traders. If you're actually an importer, I can tell you, our family business, we can hedge a year or two in front and it's not a huge problem. But those who want to build the factories, dig the mines and invent the new processes, because if you're going to actually have this, you're going to sustain this vision of a good life, we're going to need industries that actually provide goods and services that people want through jobs that are actually meaningful and valuable to them and which don't break the carbon bank. Some of them will be what I call negative carbon industries that take carbon out of the atmosphere. Some will be zero carbon industries, which is, if you like, a rare exception because either they'll be sort of some positive or negative, or there's going to be low carbon industries which do emit some carbon but are not actually held back. Now, what do we want to do? Do we want to say, well, the price might be $5 or it might be $100 for a tonne of carbon? Or do we want to have a way in which they will know that the price of carbon will increase, as we know it will have to, as the price of carbon will increase until we get down to whatever it is, 2 tonnes per person or not. So this actually comes in actually rejecting the idea of carbon trading and actually saying that it's tremendous for some, but not for those who are going to build the new industries which are going to sustain the sustainable low-carbon lifestyles. That's why I moved to a different kind of approach, carbon tax. But I'm advocating, and this is in 2007-8, I started thinking, well, yes, a carbon tax, but actually I'm keen on a particular form, which I want to explain. I call it a carbon added tax. It operates very much like a VAT or a GST. It would be imposed at each stage of production, just like a GST, on the extra carbon which is actually put into the products that are passed on up the line. This actually provides, and what I also suggest, is that at the same time as you start raising your CAT, carbon added tax, you start dropping your VAT by the same amount. Now, there might be a good idea to increase the amount of tax There might even be a good reason to now, as some people, as Rogoff suggested 5 years ago, and some people are now thinking of seriously now, that a little bit of inflation would be actually quite good, so maybe increases price. But generally, all other things being equal, it's actually, there may be reasons to increase or decrease the total tax take. There may be reason to increase or decrease the total price level. But those can be handled in other ways or by the timing of these changes. But basically, the basic principle is that you actually start dropping the value-added tax and start increasing the carbon-added tax. This has a number of benefits that I would suggest over not only carbon trading, which is dangerous, but normal forms of carbon taxes. It obviously provides negative and positive price signals as low carbon products decline in price. And I would argue, because what I'd argue though is a gradual rise in the carbon added tax. And we'll say we'll start at a low figure. I don't actually mind particularly where it starts, provided the rise is inexorable. And one of the problems of producing an inexorable rise is the political costs. I'm not actually a great fan of Milton Friedman, although I particularly like his idea of negative income tax. But the thing is that his approach he took to dealing with inflation is actually quite interesting. He said what you had to do was to convince investors that the government would keep on cracking down on inflation by raising interest rates, and that you actually needed to convince investors that that was going to happen. If there's inflationary expectations, then in that case they would be self-fulfilling unless they actually believed the government was prepared to do something about it and would keep on doing it until they are successful. The big message that you have when it comes to carbon trading, when there is a decision every few years as to what the actual level is going to be, or the carbon tax, what particular price it's going to be, any rational person looking at the amount of political infighting we've actually had, the political battle just to get our current carbon tax, fixed price for the first 3 years, any rational person will say that's not going to happen again quickly, and so it's not likely to be racked up. On the other hand, if in fact you are gradually increasing the carbon added tax, gradually decreasing the value added tax, it actually has no effect on inflation, no effect on the total tax take. It has no effect on imports and exports because, like a VAT, it is imposed on imports and rebated on exports. It actually means that you can actually sort of carbon tax in one country. And the thing is that, and because it's actually being just replacing value-added tax, you've got a huge window of opportunity. It can rise until it is, in Australia, about 6.5% of GDP. In other countries, as much as 15% of GDP. I calculate that because about 60 to 70% of the economy is GDP is consumption, and our GST is 10%. But that's a huge. No one has ever suggested you would need that higher carbon tax, but it's open to you, and it's going to keep on rising there until you get to the area that's necessary. Another advantage of it is it actually emphasised the key problem is actually the consumption of high carbon products. One of the distracting and I think very unfair ways in which the current debate about carbon trading internationally operates is that it's about the carbon you emit in producing goods, not about the amount of carbon contained in the goods you produce. So therefore, if in fact a Chinese manufacturer emits a lot of carbon in producing a cheap motor car or a cheap widget that's sold in Walmart, then that's the problem. Aren't you terrible in China? Not you're a terrible person for consuming this high carbon good. And so I think that it's, although in theory the thing is that you impose it on consumption or you impose it on production, in theory it's the same. In fact, of course, there's this huge problem that is pointed to, which some environments don't, I think, take sufficiently seriously, is that if we impose a tax in one country, it's encourages the industries to move to others. In Australia, I think Australia, of course, is both sides. We're terrible in terms of consuming carbon. On the other hand, some of the things we do, our very, very high levels of carbon emissions, is partly due to the fact that of not just aluminium smelters, but mines and so forth. When we send products out, we actually there's actually a lot of energy goes into the digging and the transport and so forth. I think it's the important thing is it's about a carbon consumption tax. It's not just a matter of justice, but it's also actually a way of dealing with the problem of differential. It's also a key way of dealing with the problems of just shifting plants from a high carbon tax place to a low carbon tax place. It will have the same incentives, of course, because if it's imposed on consumption, it will have that strong incentive to reduce consumption of high carbon products. The other thing is that I talk about taxing carbon, not consumption, and the point is that it can be returned to citizens to prevent inflation and change the tax take. As I say, the best way of doing that is through reductions of VAT. Now, the thing is, there's a lot more about this. I've written a lot, and I could need to write a lot more. There's other things I want to emphasise, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. And that is recognising that it's not just about the ethical pull and the economic push. We also need the lawyers and political scientists at various level, because we need to institutionalise, have coordinated and systematic institutional reform to support this. But I think that's the ethical pull and the economic push are at the heart of it. And the other is that it's not just about institutions, it's also about individuals. Although the architecture of institutions must always be for individuals, and we've got to recognise that we make a contribution individually as citizens, voters, as consumers and investors. That when we act, we have a responsibility for the consequences of our actions. The fact that we're acting as consumers and investors does not excuse us from that responsibility. That therefore it's our responsibility to actually think about not just our consumption, but how we vote and how we invest. And I don't have time to go into it now, but Bill Ransom and I have written a book on corporate social responsibility and social responsible investment. And one of the key things is that that an increasing proportion of the world's equity markets, even private equity run by David Rubenstein, an increasing amount of it is the ultimate owners are actually the superannuation unit holders. And ultimately the thing is that the individuals who hold those units have a long-term interest, not just an economic interest in the value of the shares that will eventually come to them, but they've got other economic interests. And they've actually got other interests too about actually having a world that they'd be proud to leave their children. So I think ultimately, those who should have the greatest power and certainly have the greatest ownership are actually increasingly mapping the people who are voters and consumers. Obviously the amount of money depends upon how much you've got to invest and how much you can consume, but I'm not necessarily sure that the different shares in wealth actually mean that their values are fundamentally different, but they need to think about them. We all need to think about it when we're acting as investors, consumers and citizens, and particularly when we're investors. I mean, the Nuremberg Principle is that if you're ordered to do something criminal, then the fact that they might otherwise send you to the Western Front is not a sufficient justification for destroying the lives of others. Now, if that's a pretty hard ask. All we're asking, of course, is that investors will say, well, I don't have to get that extra 20% return. That actually, 20 basis points on my investment, that's a fair sacrifice to put up for actually saving the world. So if the Nazi who cannot excuse himself because he'd otherwise be sent to the Russian front and die, I think the investor who won't take a lower return hardly has got a leg to stand on. But on the other hand, if in fact we give the economic incentives for the industries that sustain a sustainable good life, then actually they'll probably make a lot more money too. So ultimately, ethics and economics can be made mutually reinforcing, but we need to act as citizens, consumers and investors to make it happen.